Today I'm going to talk about the Framingham Heart Study for two reasons. First, it's a prospective cohort study, and I love those. And second, data. So much data. So, what is a prospective cohort study? First, you decide what disease or condition you're trying to study, and then you take a big group of people, a cohort, and you collect as much information from them as you possibly can. In the case of the Framingham Heart Study, the investigators, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, were looking at cardiovascular disease. They started in 1943 with 5,209 people who lived in Framingham, Massachusetts. They did a detailed medical history, a physical examination, and laboratory medical tests on all of those people. When you're doing a prospective cohort study, you do want to try and collect as much data as you can, because the idea is you have a disease or condition and you don't know what's causing it. You might have some guesses, and you might think that more than one thing could possibly factor in, so you do want to try and collect as much information as you can. It's impossible to collect everything, of course, but you do want to try. Before the Framingham Heart Study, doctors didn't know what caused arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, that is, coronary heart disease, angina pectoris, and stroke, or hypertensive cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease was, in 1943, the leading cause of death in the U.S., and it still is. And it was also the reason why life expectancy after the age of 45 had not increased since the early 1900s. And though doctors had ideas as to what might cause it, they thought that lifestyle and environmental factors played a part. They didn't know for sure. At the time, heart disease prevention wasn't really a thing. Doctors thought that the proximal causes that they did know about, the clogging and hardening of the arteries, were just a normal consequence of aging, and you couldn't really do anything about them. But they didn't know. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute decided to do an epidemiological study to find out. An epidemiological study is done to try to determine the natural history of a disease or condition, explore its behavior, and identify any factors that might influence that behavior and relate to its development. And doing a prospective cohort study is ideally suited for this. Epidemiology in general is concerned with the causes and behavior of diseases over populations, not the causes and behavior of diseases in individuals. That's medicine. So once you've selected your cohort and you've gathered as much information from them as you can, you just wait for years. You do follow-ups with them every so often. In the case of the Framingham Heart Study, that meant further physical examinations and laboratory medical tests every 2 to 5 years. And you wait to see which of your cohort develops the disease or condition that you're studying. Once you see who has developed the disease or condition, you look back at the data that you gathered at the beginning of the study and along the way to see which causes factored in. The early results that came out of the Framingham Heart Study in the 1960s are pretty famous. Almost everything that you know causes cardiovascular disease came from the FHS. One of the very first results, because it was so significant and so easy to spot, was that cigarette smoking causes an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Then, high cholesterol and high blood pressure also increase your risk. Exercise, especially cardiovascular exercise, decreases your risk of cardiovascular disease. Obesity was found to increase your risk of CVD. Now, the relationship between obesity and health is very complicated, much too complicated to get into in this video. But if you've heard that obesity causes cardiovascular disease, this is the study where it originally came from. Also, you'll notice that I'm talking about risk. Increased risk, decreased risk. That's because cardiovascular disease is complicated, and no one factor absolutely causes it. Instead, what this study found is that when you look at the people who developed cardiovascular disease, and then you look back at your data to see what factors they had or didn't have, individual factors of those, such as cigarette smoking, increased your risk. Later, less easily seen results began to come out of the Framingham Heart Study. High blood pressure also increases your risk of stroke, not just heart disease. The risk of cardiovascular disease increases in women as soon as they're postmenopausal, indicating a hormonal influence. Psychosocial factors also influence your risk of cardiovascular disease. Psychosocial refers to the relationship between your mental and emotional well-being and the environment you're in, and many psychosocial factors influence the risk of cardiovascular disease. Increased HDL cholesterol, in contrast to total cholesterol, actually decreases your risk of heart disease. Even high normal blood pressure, pre-hypertension, increases your risk. The researchers also developed the Framingham Risk Score that estimates the 10-year cardiovascular risk of an individual, and it's still used by doctors in a clinical setting today. Even things that weren't directly related to heart disease were discovered using the FHS data. For instance, whether cigarette smokers decide to quit smoking or not can depend on their social contacts, which is one of those psychosocial factors. And then the researchers got into genomics using the FHS data, including finding genes that increase your risk of atrial fibrillation and a genetic variant associated with obesity. Well, it's a lot. Over 3,000 scientific peer-reviewed papers have come out of this one study, both from researchers directly involved and also outside researchers who use the data that the FHS has made available, because they've done that. So much data. The term risk factor itself comes from the FHS. But of course, nothing is perfect. The selection of Framingham, Massachusetts made sense at the time, and even later, since health professionals from nearby Boston could be used to keep the study going. But Framingham is a white, middle-class town, so not exactly representative of the U.S., let alone the world. It has become slightly more diverse, and the study has expanded to try to be more inclusive, enrolling the Omni-1 cohort in 1994, 507 Black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, and Native American people to try to explore the relationship between race and heritage on cardiovascular disease. And there's more work to do. Another prospective cohort study that was done in the UK showed that the Framingham Heart Study, and especially the Framingham Risk Score, seem to have overestimated the risk of cardiovascular disease in British men. And since the strongest predictor of cardiovascular risk is still age, the Framingham Risk Score might not be as useful if you're in your 30s, say, except as a predictor of much more future risk. Your doctor should always help you take into account all the risk factors associated with cardiovascular disease, not a doctor, by the way, and not treat you like you're just a number. Still, the Framingham Heart Study has given us so much information, and it's just cool. It's still going, by the way. An offspring cohort, exactly what it sounds like, was enrolled in 1971, and there's also a Generation 3 cohort, the grandchildren of the original cohort, as well as an Omni 2 cohort, which is children of the Omni 1, the more diverse cohort. Overall, over 14,000 participants have been enrolled in the Framingham Heart Study. And when you think about how much long-term, consistent, hard work it has been to follow those participants for so many years, it's really amazing. We're still getting so many results from it. One of the more recent is that the incidence rate of dementia has actually decreased in FHS participants over the course of the study. Now, whether that's applicable to the entire world or it's just specific to these particular participants, we don't know yet, but it's a fascinating result that needs more research. But since the Framingham Heart Study is still ongoing, we'll be getting more results from it for years to come. And now you know why I like prospective cohort studies so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and you think you'll be interested in more videos about public health, click like and subscribe. Thank you. I hope to see you soon.